Good afternoon. As we wait for people to connect, I want to thank you for joining us for a discussion on the crisis in northern Israel. I'm Rachel Rosen. I'm the Chief Communications Officer for Democratic Majority for Israel. On behalf of our staff, our President Mark Melman, our board, and our board co-chairs who are with us today, Todd Richmond and Ann Lewis, welcome. Before we get started, I wanted to acknowledge the tragic school shooting at a Georgia high school today. Seems to have happened a little while ago, and initial reports say a number of people were killed and more were injured. Our hearts go out to the entire community, to the students, and to the families. I also want to acknowledge the pain and anguish we're all feeling with the murder of 6 hostages over the weekend. A DMFI hosted Carmel Gott's relative, among other hostage families, at an event we hosted during the DNC in Chicago last month. May their memories be a blessing. Turning to our event today, if you like what you're hearing, please consider checking us out on social media. We're on X, we're on Instagram, we're on Facebook, and you can sign up for our news and updates at dmfi.org. And for today, if you'd like to ask a question, you can submit it through the Q&A feature in Zoom, or if you're joining us on Facebook, you can just put it into the comment section. Now I'm very pleased to turn it over to our board co-chair, Ann Lewis, to introduce our distinguished guests. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. It is my pleasure to introduce such distinguished speakers. I'm going to begin with Dr. Matthew Levitt. He is the Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute, where he directs the program on counterterrorism and intelligence. Dr. Levitt previously served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at the United States Department of Treasury from 2005 to 2007, where he was a key figure in protecting the United States financial system from terrorism. Dr. Levitt has also served as a counterterrorism advisor to the Special Envoy for Middle East Regional Security at the State Department, and as a counterterrorism intelligence analyst at the Federal Bureau of Investigation, where he provided tactical and strategic analytical support for counterterrorism operations, focusing on fundraising logistical support networks for Middle Eastern terrorist groups. For his work, Dr. Levitt has earned numerous awards and commendations for government service at both the FBI and the Treasury Department. And perhaps more important for many of us, he has earned our trust and respect for his work on behalf of national and international security. We are pleased to have him. This is someone I have heard from so often, and now I get to talk about him. I'm personally pleased, but on behalf of all of us, welcome, Dr. Levitt. We look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much, Ann. Thank you for Democratic Majority for Israel for having me and for everybody participating. With that introduction, I really hope my Jewish mother was listening. Look, I've been to Israel 3 times now since October 7th. I'll be there again over the anniversary. The first 2 times I focused on the South for obvious reasons. And just a few weeks ago, I went for the particular purpose of focusing on the North. I've been going to Israel's northern border and touring either the border with Lebanon along the Blue Line to see what's happening with Hezbollah, or along the Golan Heights over the past few years to see what was happening with Islamic State there or the Assad regime. I've been doing that for at least, 12 to 15 years. And at least over the past several years, every year, Israeli officials in Northern Command briefed me on a plot that they knew Hezbollah was thinking about, they knew Hezbollah was acting on, but had not yet operationalized. And it was a plot to storm across the border from the north, kill a bunch of Israelis, kidnap a bunch of Israelis, set booby traps and roadside improvised explosive devices, bombs, to target Israeli first responders, and basically dare Israel to try and rescue its hostages and retrieve bodies in Lebanon. So one of the many shocks of October 7th was that this plot materialized, but not in the north, that Hamas actually carried out Hezbollah's plot and not in Lebanon, from Lebanon, but from Gaza. It's important to understand that today because everybody is very focused on the rocket threat from Hezbollah with very, very good reason. Probably at least 150,000, probably more projectiles of different types. And even if only, 20,000 of them, 20,000 of them are truly smart rockets, precision guided munitions, and maybe it's more, but even if it's only that, that presents a tremendous threat. They can overwhelm even Israel's 4-tier air defense system with volume. And so you could have a situation where Israel would be fighting a fight that would be as much on the home front as it would be on someone else's territory, where you could have significant loss to critical infrastructure, whether it's the electrical grid or desalination plants, hospitals, roads and bridges, the airport, etc. And that's a huge, huge concern. But my fear, especially coming back from my recent trip, is that not enough people are paying attention to the threat of Hezbollah's ground forces. Put yourself in the shoes of the 60,000 plus Israelis who are displaced from their homes in the north. They are not going to go home until someone is able to show them that something's been done to prevent the possibility of a Hezbollah ground incursion along the lines of October 7th in the north. On October 7th itself, there were a sum total of about 600 IDF personnel across the entirety of the northern border, and not all of those were combat troops. On this recent trip, I sat in a Jeep in full body armor. It was my Mike Dukakis moment. And we drove up past checkpoints, and he explained to me if Hezbollah had decided on October 7th or October 8th to storm across the border, he said to me, would have been stopping them at Haifa. It's a huge concern, and no Israeli, not in the north and not in the south, is going to kind of sit back and comfortably accept IDF, Shin Bet, Mossad, anybody's, hey, it's going to be okay, because that's what they took on through and including October 6th, and it's not going to cut it any longer. And so my fear is that if we can safely assume that we've kind of made it past at least most of the retaliatory intent from Hezbollah and Iran after the Israeli strikes that killed Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, and the day before Hezbollah operational commander Fuad Shukr in Lebanon, even if we can assume that that kind of presumed rocket response is largely over, we still have a very near threat of a war in Israel's north, a full-fledged war in Israel's north, because Israel feels the need to do something to be able to enable its 60,000 plus citizens to go home. Now, there's a huge diplomatic push right now, and Amos Hochstein from the administration and Brett McGurk and others are very involved in it. Israeli and other press are reporting just this morning that there is a secret meeting that wasn't previously reported. And the effort is to try and convince Hezbollah to redeploy at least its special forces, the Radwan forces, 10 kilometers from the border. They're already probably 5 kilometers from the border now, because the IDF, the Israeli Air Force, have really cleared the entire area right on the blue line from any large Hezbollah presence and any large Hezbollah infrastructure. There's still Hezbollah fighters right there, but they live in those homes. The 10 kilometers is not a random number. It is the outer limit of the 3rd generation Cornet anti-tank guided missile, which is the munition that has been used in the overwhelming majority, not all, but the overwhelming majority of Hezbollah's rocket attacks over the past 10 plus months. And at a minimum, being 10 kilometers away would give Israel a little bit more of a warning period if they were to start seeing people flooding towards the border. The second thing is tunnels. We've learned the lesson of not anticipating that there are as many tunnels or as strategic tunnels as we thought in the case of Gaza. And that has to be something that's coming up now in Lebanon as well. Hezbollah definitely has tunnels. I've personally been in, I think, 6 Hamas tunnels and 1 Hezbollah tunnel. And the Hezbollah tunnels are extremely sophisticated. And if there are significant tunnels in size, in number, then the concern would be that even a 10-kilometer buffer zone wouldn't do you very much if Hezbollah fighters could move all the way to the border underground and potentially not be seen. So my concern is that, rockets aside, we are facing a moment of truth on the Hezbollah ground forces as well. And there is a significant voice within Israel's Northern Command, within the Joint Chiefs of Staff, within communities in the North, saying, as much as we don't want war and we don't invite war, now is the time to strike Hezbollah hard because A, the IDF is already fully deployed up there. And if you allow people to go home and you try and call them up a few months or a year later, that's much more difficult. The only silver lining to the fact that the 60,000 plus Israeli civilians are displaced from the north is they're displaced from the north right now. Like, you already have that battle space opened up. You might as well use it. And there's finally, again, just the lack of faith in the system that something short of a full-fledged war will be able to create the kind of conditions that Israelis will need to go home. So let me stop there with my introductory comments, kind of give a little bit of the lay of the land. I just want to say it's a real pleasure to be able to do this together with my friend Assaf, and I look forward to the questions.
Well, and speaking of your friend Assaf, we turn now to hear from General Assaf Orion, a retired Israeli brigadier general and defense strategist whose research ranges from relationships with China to Israel's regional, political, military strategy and policy. He is currently a fellow with the Washington Institute. During his career in the IDF, General Orion was responsible for strategic policy formulation, international cooperation, and military diplomacy. In his most recent position as head of the strategic division in the Planning Directorate, he was in charge of communication with the UN interim force in Lebanon, with the Lebanese Army. He led staff meetings with counterparts from the Pentagon and other Western militaries, and represented the IDF in talks with the Palestinian Authority. After retiring from the IDF in 2016, General Orion joined the Institute for National Security Studies in Tel Aviv, where he serves as Senior Research Fellow, head of the Countering Boycott, Divestment, and Delegitimization Program, which means he is on the front line in many directions. And especially at this moment and at this time, we are honored to have him with us and look forward to hearing from him. General?
Thank you, Anne, for the kind words and the invitation. I'll try to share, after the very good opening of my friend Matt, to try to portray the same picture from another angle, which is a strategic planner's angle. First, we're discussing the Lebanon front of Israel's war, when many of us hear and read that it's the war in Gaza. In fact, we're talking about a multi-front campaign waged by Iran and its proxies from at least 7 frontiers around Israel. So Israel is surrounded with that offensive capability, working against it, seeking attrition and finally destruction of Israel. It's important to say it because it puts the whole Lebanon issue in a grander context. The same context has to be examined against Israel's war goals as set on October 16th, a week after October 7th in the Negev. And keeping in mind that on the 8th of October, Hezbollah starting to attack Israel as a kind of solidarity, and also sending a hand to Hamas to bifurcate Israel's forces and to pin down some of its capabilities northward, so it won't be able to focus down south. But Israel's war goals of that day mostly focus on Gaza, defining the main problem in Gaza, defining the main goal as eradicating Hamas in Gaza, both militarily and the governmental capabilities. There's a line about retrieving our hostages, and the Northern Front is kindly asked not to interfere, not to raise hell, not to start any wide escalation, and not to divert efforts and resources from the southern and the main front in the south. So keeping this in mind, we understand that there is some kind of gap between the actual situation and Israel's war goals, which weren't updated since then, even though recently we heard from a senior political source saying the safe return of the northern displaced civilians to their communities is part and parcel of the war goals. It's not. That's just propaganda. But Israel is definitely skewed on the horns of the dilemma. What do you do when you have two active fronts like that in Lebanon and in Gaza at the same time? Mostly and historically, what Israel did in such cases was phasing. You deal with one, then you turn and deal with the other, fighting on inner lines and allowing yourself to create local superiority in each sector separately. Now let's look at the wicked composite problem set of Hezbollah in Lebanon. There is a direct fire ongoing every day since October 8th. That's unprecedented. We never had such a situation. Second, we have, as Matt said, we have a near border threat by assault forces and by short-range rocket forces and by anti-tank guided missile launchers and so on and so forth. So the near border area is responsible for generating a very thick layer of problems and threats. This is what was in the eyes of the planners and the commanders and the leadership when they say, okay, let's evacuate our northern communities before they get the special treatment that the Negev just absorbed. That's not enough. The next thing is what's happening at the depth. Hezbollah's great arsenal, the rocketry, the missiles, what Matt mentioned, the precision capabilities, the UAVs and drones, the coast-to-sea missiles threatening our oil rigs, the precision missiles threatening our infrastructure, and so on and so forth. So that's just the military contour of the problem. But then let's look deeper. Strategically, it's interconnected to Gaza. It's interconnected to Iran. Both of those theaters, Hassan Nasrallah says, I won't stop attacking Israel until Gaza is quiet. Definitely, for years, we said if Israel is going to strike Iran's nuclear program, definitely Hezbollah will join. These days, we also heard from the Iranians that if Israel goes to war on Hezbollah, Iran would join on a devastating war. So we have this interconnectivity between the theaters, which is very problematic, not to mention the fires from Yemen against the international shipping and Israeli shipping, the fires from Iraq, occasionally from Syria, and as we saw in mid-April, from Iran itself directly. If we add the next element is Hezbollah's connectivity to Iran's logistic base. So although it's a mediocre sect in Lebanon, the Shiite sect, and its resources are limited, it's connected to a wealth fund of a very large energy country with good scientific and production capabilities. And this explains why all those theaters I mentioned from Yemen to Lebanon are spewing the same kind of munitions, shooting at Israel or international shipping or Saudi Arabia or Jordan and so on and so forth. So we understand it's one system. Why is it important to mention? Because no single treatment, so to speak, or response in Lebanon will delete or prevent the rearming and reconstitution of those forces. And it's a remnant of what we hear recently about Gaza and the Philadelphia road, not because of the positions that were presented there were correct, but logistic and rearming is part and parcel of dealing with the problems we face. And on top of that, you have Palestinian organizations attacking Israel from Lebanese territory. So that's another frontier of the Palestinian conflict, looking at Israel and attacking Israel from Lebanon and also from Syria occasionally. And when you have all these packed together, we need to remind ourselves that Hezbollah both creates the weak Lebanese state and enjoys the weakness. So there's a statelet of Hezbollah, actually a state within a state, and it runs its own security and foreign policy, deciding when to go to war and when not, and so on. So when Israel looks at that wicked problem, it needs to also create a fit between its policy and strategy to the structure of the problem. It's not enough to go for a limited operation and deal with one problem. What Matt mentioned about Amos Hochstein, it's going to deal with a fire problem and maybe the near border problem. So we need, in every approach that we hear, to ask ourselves, okay, which parts of this wicked problem does this approach address, and which parts are left unintended? I'll stop here.
Thank you, Assaf, and thank you, Matt. We're going to move to the Q&A portion of the discussion. So if you have questions for these gentlemen, please put them into the Q&A section. We have a question that someone has posed on Instagram that I will expand on a bit myself. Is there any way for the people up north to get home without a war? What would motivate Hezbollah to stop firing at Israeli towns without military force? And to expand on that, as we're all aware, Israel's borders have effectively shrunk since October 7th, and that's not really tenable. So what needs to be done to ensure that these displaced folks in the north can get back home? Matt, would you like to begin?
Sure. So there are two possibilities. One is Hassan Nasrallah, the head of Hezbollah, has pretty astutely announced that the continued Hezbollah firing from Lebanon into Israel will continue until there is a ceasefire deal and an end to the fighting in Gaza. And he has said that the man who is making those decisions is none other than Yahya Sinwar, the head of Hamas in the Gaza Strip. On the one hand, that gives Hamas additional leverage, right? Because this deal now is not only about securing the release of the hostages and the bodies of those hostages who've been killed, but also about ending the fighting in the north. So that's one way that this could happen. And there's still a huge push for this. And there's a very huge domestic political movement within Israel that says, do whatever has to be done to be able to get the remaining hostages home, especially after the tragedy of the 6 hostages who were just murdered. The second way this happens is if part of the Amos Hochstein, Brett McGurk, etc. The Europeans are also involved in this tangentially effort to diplomatically just convince Hezbollah that neither Hezbollah nor Lebanon more broadly, nor the region really want full-fledged war at this time. A full-fledged war would be really, really difficult for Israel. It would be even more so for Lebanon. And I think there are two main things that have prevented Hezbollah from engaging even more than it has over the past 10 plus months. One is that Lebanon has been suffering for quite some time now from both political, but more importantly, economic crises. And Lebanese understand that a war would be devastating for Lebanon, even if it would be devastating for Israel too. There's only so many hours of rolling electricity they get now. Hezbollah has been involved in things like the Beirut explosion tragedy. People in Lebanon overwhelmingly don't want another massive war. And Hezbollah has to assume that people wouldn't kind of rally around Hezbollah necessarily if they felt that this war happened because of Hezbollah. The second thing is tied to Iran. It's not like either Iran or Hezbollah become Zionists. But over the past 10.5 months, the Iranians have been ratcheting up their nuclear program. And the Iranians do see, as Assaf mentioned, Hezbollah's missile capability as their best way to either deter Israel or anybody else from attacking their program. And therefore, they want that powder kept dry. Don't use all those rockets now. And or as their best second strike capability in the event that someone does target their program. And so they have their own interest in wanting that powder dry. And finally, Iran also has a history of being willing to fight to the last Arab. You could expand that now, fighting to the last non-Persian Shia. They do not want a regional war if that regional war is going to cross the border into Iran. One of the reasons they were so sensitive about the operation that targeted Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in Tehran, there for the presidential inauguration in an IRGC safe house, et cetera, isn't just the obvious, but also that, you know, for all those Iranians who are not too happy with the regime, and it's not small numbers, they're concerned that those people are going to look and say, wait a minute, you know, the IRGC is not 10 feet tall. That they're afraid of looking weak. They don't want this to come back home. And so there is that prospect. The flip side is that, let's say there is a ceasefire deal, please God, and let's say Hezbollah stops firing. Do Israelis feel comfortable enough to go home with that alone, or do they, from their own Israeli security needs, still worry about a Hezbollah ground incursion and need the IDF to do something more to give them that sense of safety and protection?
Thank you, Matt. Assaf, anything you wanted to add on that question?
No, I think Matt covered most of it.
Okay, I'll go to you with the next question. What kind of weapons would be needed to destroy these Hezbollah tunnels, and does Israel possess them?
We definitely possess them. They are land forces troops and a lot of explosives. That means that it needs a stand-in operation, going in, finding the openings. We see it in Gaza. Gaza is a sandy area. South Lebanon is more rocky. It's a different architecture of tunnels. It needs very good intelligence to be able to find the beginning. But we need to remember that a tunnel is like a submarine. Only the submarine can move, and the tunnel, once it's exposed, it's all compromised. So it'll be a very substantial mission, although that's not our main challenge there, I think.
Okay. I think I'd like to turn to Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza for a bit. Is it possible to dismantle Hamas, and to what extent has Israel been successful there? Matt, I'll turn to you.
Since October 8th, I've been telling every Israeli official who will listen, and many who didn't want to stop saying they will destroy Hamas. You know, we led an international coalition against the Islamic State. We did not destroy the Islamic State. We inflicted territorial defeat on the Islamic State. We destroyed its governance project. Islamic State cells, Islamic State provinces even exist around the world, and we're still contending with it. There was just a ministerial level meeting for the counter-ISIS coalition here in Washington. Actually, there's going to be in about a week. And so when Netanyahu talks about total defeat, it frustrates me. To me, that's a slogan. It's not a strategy. What you want to talk about is inflicting territorial defeat on Hamas, creating a situation where Hamas can no longer govern, where they are no longer seen as a viable or attractive partner in whatever political entity comes next, because that's what they want, not to govern alone, but to be a part of what comes next. And making it so that their ability to carry out not only just like an October 7th, but any type of significant terrorist threat is done. So incapacitating as many of their core fighters as possible, destroying their military industrial complex, destroying their strategic assets like the tunnels. Those are the measurements by which we should be judging this. There is the very, very, very painful reality that Hamas very purposefully is fighting from behind civilians, from behind, from under, from within hospitals. The entrance to the tunnel from which these 6 Israeli murdered hostages were found was in a nursery type of area. And so that's led to a lot of dead civilians in Gaza. And we should all be pained by that. But that's on Hamas. And there's only so much you can do about that. So I think that by most measurements, the Israelis are very slowly being very, very successful when it comes to Hamas, but at very high cost. Not only high cost in Israelis who are wounded, to the Israeli economy, to the Israeli war fighters who are exhausted, to the Palestinian society, but also to Israel's reputation on the international stage. And that's something that's going to take some time to rebuild.
Assaf?
Yeah, I would only add that dismantling, as you asked, is pertains to taking apart the units of Hamas army. We're talking about a terror army, making sure that they cannot operate brigades and battalions as they did before, making sure their most experienced commanders meet their creator as soon as possible. And in this sense, allowing us to get to the end state that Matt correctly defined as removing the threat over time. So it needs to be an enduring achievement, which again addresses the question of rearming, reconstituting, and so on and so forth. But basically speaking, since Hamas is a governing actor in Gaza, it cannot be removed without growing something else that will fill the vacuum. And on this, the government of Israel has been quite insistent not to go there. And in the recent weeks, you could identify maybe some thoughts about direct control of the IDF in Gaza, which is not something that the IDF would like. Its costs are inhibitive, and it's calling for an alternative approach. What Matt mentioned about hiding behind civilians is actually the Iranian school of thought, or school of war, if we wish. It's going to be the same in Lebanon. You could see that the IDF already attacks thousands of targets in South Lebanon, military targets, totally kosher. But many of them are homes and private houses where there was a children's room, living room, and missile room. So we need to understand how this duplicity of uses is undermining Israel, but also putting Lebanese and Palestinians at harm's way.
And if you could both address this, is there an inherent conflict between the urgent desire to free the hostages, but also to defeat Hamas? And how do you go about thinking about that problem? Matt?
With difficulty. I don't mean to downplay it, quite the opposite. The reality is that there is an absolute necessity, and time is of the essence, to secure the release of the remaining hostages who are alive. Hamas has made it quite clear that they're willing to kill them. Those some who survived and some whose bodies have been recovered, it's quite clear there's tremendous malnutrition to the point of starving. And so this is the time is of the essence. And so there's a school of thought, and I'm there now, that says we got to do what we have to do within reason to secure the release of the hostages. If that includes, for example, redeploying most or even theoretically all forces from the Philadelphia corridor, in the moment, do it. And if you then need to go back in and take it again, which would not necessarily be easy, you do that too. Philadelphia corridor, that area between the border of that is the border between Gaza and Egypt, that was a real turning point when the IDF went in and controlled that area of space. It took a few weeks, over which time the supplies that had already been smuggled in from those tunnels from Egypt dwindled. But once they ran out of those weapons and ammunition and supplies and cash, they couldn't resupply. And cash, by the way, is pretty important here. Gaza's a cash-based economy. There's a liquidity problem. If I want to send money to Hamas in Gaza, I got to do that through a hawala or a money exchanger. And so I say I'm going to send money to my friend Assaf, and I'm going to give Assaf the code word, and The money changer will tell his buddy money changer where Assaf is, and Assaf goes with the code and says, "Give me my money." And the guy says, "I have no cash to give you." Right? And so this was a real crisis for Hamas. If Hamas thinks that Israel's just going to redeploy from there forever and never look back, they got another thing coming. But in the immediate, it's imperative to rescue those hostages who can still be rescued.
Thank you. Assaf.
Well, the main point, as Matt said, needs to be emphasized. It's time. If you say either defeat or hostage release, that's a false choice, because you're pressing the dilemma to a single moment in time. So maybe you can't do it together, because if you're fighting in Gaza, they kill your hostages. And if you're fighting in Gaza, you can't reach a deal, and so on. But if you understand that the campaign against Hamas is going to be generational, we're talking about a decade or a generation, 25 years, until there's a real change in Gaza, you understand that waiting a month or two is not going to stop the enduring defeat that we're aiming at. How do I know? Matt mentioned that we went into Philadelphia. That was in May. What happened in the months since October 7th, 3 weeks before we started maneuvering? Then northern Gaza, not Rafah, not Philadelphia. Then Khan Yunis, not Philadelphia. Then finally Philadelphia, and then you can't afford to withdraw some weeks. I think that's a false description. And we need to adopt a long view of that problem. It's going to be a long struggle, and we need to use time as we do in long wars. That being said, we cannot afford long wars of high intensity. We need to, let's say, modulate our campaign into a more affordable mode, both in blood and in treasure, and then set ourselves for the long race. You don't do dashes when you start a 100-mile marathon.
Thank you. What impact has the U.S. military buildup had on the region? What signals is it sending to the bad actors all around in the region? Matt, I'll go to you first.
I was asked on a podcast right after the U.S. sent aircraft carriers to the Eastern Med, and Nasrallah had given a speech where he spent about 22 minutes saying in different ways, "I don't see those ships. Those ships mean nothing to me." So after 22 minutes of telling me how he doesn't see the ships, I said on the podcast, like, we get it. He sees the ships, right? There's no question in my mind, none, that the U.S. deployments right after October 7th, that the U.S. efforts side by side, shoulder to shoulder with Israel in April, preparing for and then defending against an Iranian air campaign directly attacking Israel, which had tremendous success in defeating that Iranian effort to bomb Israel with drones and low-altitude cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, and then again more recently, and continuing now with even sending and being public about sending a very significant submarine and very particular types of Air Force fighter jets and ships to the region in the context of the Iranian and Hezbollah threats against Israel. Again, there is no question in my mind that this has had a tremendous impact in deterring Iran and Hezbollah from doing a lot more. In my conversations with some of the most senior Israeli military and security officials, they tell me from their perspective that this has been a game changer, that it is a level of U.S. tactical support like they've never seen. And wherever one sits in the political spectrum, I have said over and over the past few months, wherever one sits on the political spectrum, we as Jewish Americans should all be very, very proud and grateful for the way the Biden administration has responded. There will be people who will respond and say, oh, what about withholding weapons? Actually, this is largely much ado about nothing. It's only a very particular type of weapon that the U.S. was concerned that Israel was going to use in a way to make things more complicated in Rafah. Israel did what it needed to do anyway without that weapon. All the other weapons continued flowing. Is U.S. support for Israel over the past 10.5 months has been remarkable. And I think it made a tremendous difference.
Thank you. Assaf?
Well, the highest utility of a military force is when it's implied, not necessarily employed. There's a strategic term called force in being. It's enough to have the force around to already affect the calculus of all those around it, that they need to think about the options, at what the potential it creates, and what they need to calculate as potential costs and implications, and branching options that may jump from there. So that's, I think, the most strategic effect of deterrence and affecting enemy calculus. Second, it sends a very strong signal about Israel's alleged isolation. Those ships at sea basically, spell out Israel is not alone. And if you want some trouble, we are also here. If you're interested. And it does a lot, again, about the calculus of, okay, if we only continue to isolate Israel so and so, we can finally beat it down. No, you can't. There's a backstop to it. And it's the US Navy, Air Force, Army, and so on. Logistically, it allows Israel to fight beyond its own industrial base. So it may need to take as it needs. We can do it because we enjoy actually America as our logistical power base. There is the unseen aspect of intelligence, helping on a very high level, targeting, finding high value targets, finding Hamas leadership as it's been reported. Going after understanding what's going on with the hostages. All these are invaluable contribution. And we need also to take into account that the whole front of protecting Israel from Yemen, all the flying objects flying from Yemen, the first tier that they're meeting is US forces, US coalition forces. We need not only to think about the air defenses and the interceptors spent and so on, but also the convening and coalescing capability of the United States, bringing a coalition together to such a triumph of like a mid-April countering and failing of Iran's offensive. So I think that's a very rich toolbox or spectrum of effects from the strategic to the operational tactical, which Israel needs seriously to be grateful for.
I'm going to ask one more question about northern Israel, and then I want to turn to a question on the West Bank. We have a question from Rueven. Is the entire northern border in danger, or is it mostly the areas that have already been evacuated? Matt, you're on mute.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Look, it's largely the areas that have already been evacuated, which, depending on where you are, is about 2 to 4 kilometers from the border. That's in terms of a cross-border raid. Hezbollah has all kinds of munitions, short range, medium, long range, they can hit basically anywhere in the length and width of Israel, certainly anywhere in the north. And the assumption is that they have some munitions that they haven't used yet. They call their surprises. They've already deployed a couple of these. So in the immediate, we're talking about the areas that are already deployed. If there were to be full-fledged war, it would broaden from that significantly, and it would not be limited to those communities in the north. Even just this recent incident where Israel preemptively struck Hezbollah launchers after they had intelligence that Hezbollah was going to strike. The intelligence was really detailed. By the way, it purportedly was a combination of Israeli and American intelligence. The intelligence was that they were planning to, among other things, target the Mossad headquarters and Unit 8200 headquarters, the Israeli equivalent of the National Security Agency in Galilot, which is a suburb of basically a part of Tel Aviv. So it would not at all be limited to those communities in the north.
Assaf, you're welcome to sort of address that question, but if you do, could you also talk about escalating tensions and security issues in the West Bank and how you're thinking about that region?
Well, we understand that, as I said before, since Iran is the provider of all those flying objects we're being hit with, from Yemen to Iraq, and Iran itself and Hezbollah. We understand that we can be covered 360. Eilat has been attacked by Iraqi missiles. Iran tried to attack in the Negev. Yemen hit Tel Aviv. That's a pretty long flight. And Hezbollah basically tries to penetrate our airspace every day. Just, I think, yesterday or this morning in Israel, 65 rockets in the Kiryat Shmona area, very close. But they have missiles and rockets until 700 kilometers. That's just ballistic. Not talking about cruise and so on. So there's no place safe when Hezbollah decides to unleash all of its arsenal. Except that Israel is not going to sit idly and wait for this to happen. So this is what brings to mind both preemption and prevention. About the West Bank, Iran, Hezbollah, and Hamas identified a potential to flood the West Bank with arms and funds coming through Syria to Jordan and through the Jordanian border into the West Bank. Weapon grade, new standard issued IEDs is what we saw. Sorry, my camera just went berserk. We see explosive cars beginning to return to the landscape. We see under road and side road bombs. We see gunmen galore. I think we just killed about 30 or 40 of them just in the last 2 weeks in a large operation in the West Bank. So what Iran is trying to do is to light up another front in its multi-front war with Israel, and if possible, also to let it overflow into Israeli territory. One of the explosive attacks, which fizzled, like the guy killed himself, was in Tel Aviv. So it's just a flash of luck that it didn't end up in a synagogue or somewhere crowded.
Thank you, Assaf. Matt, would you like the last word on this?
Never say no when offered the last word. Listen, 3 months before October 7th, we published a study on smuggling across Israel's borders. I'm not talking about Gaza, directly from Jordan into Israel and from Egypt into Israel, south of Gaza. From Egypt into Israel was almost entirely drugs, but we're talking about the same criminal networks, largely Bedouin, that are also able to move weapons into Gaza. From the Jordan side, we're talking mostly about guns, mostly, but not only small arms and explosives. And one of the things that we found was driving this was an Iranian decision to change how they did business smuggling weapons to the West Bank. It used to be that they would really be kind of careful to make sure the weapons went to, these Hamas people or those Palestinian Islamic Jihad people. Maybe if Fatah Tanzim were active, they'd send them some stuff too. They made a decision to change how they did business and just flood the West Bank with weapons. Anybody who wants a gun gets a gun, to destabilize the West Bank, and it was extremely successful. And that's what we're dealing with now. And it gets back to Assaf's point of Israel effectively fighting on 7 fronts. And it's amazing to me how capably, with US support, they have been able to fight this small country with a small population and therefore a small military very effectively on all fronts. And it's because part of the IDF doctrine is to engage not only in active defense, but active offense, and typically at the same time. So like Assaf said, Israel is not sitting around waiting, are we going to be struck and can we shoot down all the rockets? Yes, they've invested in 4-tier air defense systems, and they've got a very, very active home front defensive capability, but they're also looking to understand when is Hezbollah planning to do what, and if they know, and if there's actionable information, they will act to prevent it. And if you look at what Israel did against Hezbollah recently, they didn't target Beirut. They didn't start blowing up all of the south and all of the Bekaa. Very targeted, very robust, but very targeted strikes, taking out not every launcher, but a whole lot of them. And at the end of the day, though Hezbollah claimed victory because it then shot a bunch of short-range rockets into the north, which is what they're doing on a daily basis anyway. At the end of the day, I'm convinced they sat back and said, holy cow, right? I mean, complete failure at the end of the day. And that has to do with the Israeli posture, and the Israeli posture is possible because of the American posture. And I see the U.S. role in enabling Israel to defend itself. Israel's never asking for us to send people to defend it, but us enabling Israel to defend itself as being something that we as Americans, and specifically as American Jews, should be very, very proud of.
Agreed. And I think that's a good and appropriate place to end it. Dr. Matt Levitt, General Assaf Orion, thank you very much for breaking down these complex issues, and grateful for your insights. I know there's a lot of demand on your time. I'm going to hand it over to our board co-chair, Todd Richmond, from here. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel and Matt and Assaf. You guys were just amazing. If everyone could just bear with me for another minute or two. Once again, Matt and Assaf, thank you. I'm a proud supporter of the Washington Institute and love following you guys, and I encourage everybody to as well. As we heard today, we talked a lot about what's happening in the North, and I'm proud to say that Democratic Majority for Israel, with your help, has really been at the forefront of making sure that what's going on in the North is front and center for members of Congress and the U.S. Senate. We have brought numerous refugees, Israeli refugees from the North, to Capitol Hill to tell their story and to make sure that Congress understands what's going on there and why it is so important to support Israel in its defense and protection of its people. But as I said before, this can only be done with everybody's help on this Zoom. And so please go to dmfi.org, click on support, donate. We have a lot to do between now and the middle of November, and from now until the end of December. We need to make sure that people know what's going on, and that's our job. But once again, only could do it with your help. So thank you again. Please donate, please support, please follow, please spread the word, and have a great day. And let's not forget, bring the hostages home.